Welcome back to Holistic Healing Association. I'm Erin Darcy, and this is
Terhi Korkiakangas. I'm a research psychologist, writer, and educator, and I specialize in developmental psychology. And we are here to talk about prenatal life and pregnancy from a trauma-informed lens.
what is the view of developmental psychology from a very young age, right from the beginning?
So developmental psychology is very interested in kind of experiences that can overwhelm development, and especially what is the role of the early life. And how the very early experiences shape children's development in terms of regulating emotions and establishing secure attachments and establishing a sense of self. So attachment theory is one of the most important theories in developmental psychology in this sense. It was established by John Bowlby in the 1950s and 60s. And with Mary Ainsworth's work in the 70s to look into different attachment patterns. So it's really looking into the biological basis of attachment. So the child needs to attach to their caregivers in order to survive. And the quality of parenting becomes very important in the early life. Ainsworth's work showed us that there can be securely attached infants. So usually these are children who are parented in a very nurturing and warm, receptive, attuned environment. And then there are insecurely attached babies who are more prone to have trauma. They can come from neglectful, abusive households, and they might have a lot of problems later on emotionally in emotion regulation and just emotional well-being, mental health, and so on. And key to the attachment theory is this concept of internal working models. So does the baby, through the caregiving relationship, establish a sense of self as worthy of love? Worthy of trust? Can the baby trust other people? Or do they feel like the world is kind of unsafe, people are unsafe, and therefore children begin to develop a lot of coping mechanisms that become very defensive, but that's their way to cope with the early experience. So I'm saying all this because attachment theory is mainly being focused on the postnatal life. So from the time that a baby is born, usually up until the first year of life, this is when the attachment security or insecurity is established. But now we know in developmental psychology that the origins of all this can go a lot earlier, so into the prenatal life. So we know that there's a lot that happens in utero for baby that can have really long-lasting consequences, not only for the attachment security, but for how the baby and the child begins to regulate their emotions. So one way in which this happens is that if the mother has a lot of stress during the pregnancy, a very kind of chronic and toxic stress causes a lot of cortisol and adrenaline in the mom's body. And what will happen is that hormone will cross the placenta into the baby, and the baby begins to feel what the mother feels. And the problem here is that if the stress is very chronic, if mom is having a really hard time during pregnancy, then the baby's neurobiology starts to mold accordingly. So baby is preparing for life outside the womb. And if the experience in utero is very stressful, which I mean is there's a lot of cortisol flooding in the system, it begins to impact how many survival mechanisms the baby's body and brain needs to develop. So this goes into really molding the baby's brain in utero. For instance, we know that if there's been a lot of toxic stress, the areas of the prefrontal cortex, which is the kind of where the social brain of the adult lies in the prefrontal areas. Sometimes babies have smaller prefrontal areas when they are born. Of course, prefrontal cortex is something that keeps developing up until the mid-20s. But it begins already take shape in utero. So these are like really important brain-based findings that we know how important it is to look into the life in the womb.
Do babies remember the time they spent in the utero?
So that is something that the science is still debating. But what we do know is that fetal memory is real. So there are many research studies that have looked at how babies remember sounds and sensations in utero. And for instance, fetal hearing starts around 25 weeks of gestation. And we know that some newborn babies actually recognize and show preference to the sounds that they were hearing prenatally in the womb. So there's a lot of evidence for that. Also, taste and smell. We know that babies or fetus, when it's been exposed to certain tastes, foods, they will have preference for that when they are born. So there's a link there, which tells us that there is memory forming in utero. That is not a similar memory that we would have explicit memory. So these are kind of implicit sensory memories that are forming. And another kind of memory, which isn't memory per se in the sense that we would generally understand memory, is this idea that stress and trauma of the mother can have long-term effects on the body and neurobiology and nervous system of the child. So the body remembers the prenatal life from the womb. So they're encoded in the sensory systems of the body.
And does the baby feel the mother's emotions?
Yeah, so this is the idea about the cortisol flooding into the system is one evidence for that. So we know that babies react to cortisol. There can be accelerated heart rate for the baby when they feel the mother's anxiety spiking up. And we know that during the second trimester, babies can start to feel, show how they move and how they respond. They can show some kind of like pleasure or feeling uncomfortable. But these are not emotions in the sense that you and I understand emotions today. The baby cannot name what they're feeling. Baby is pure sensation and feeling the hormonal chemical messages from mother's blood, and that becomes the sensation. But during the third trimester, when the limbic system of the brain is developing more rapidly, and this is the emotion center of the brain, and research is suggesting that it is the third trimester when the baby is perhaps more susceptible to the emotions of the mom. So perhaps in the first trimester, not so much. Perhaps starting in the beginning of the second trimester, starting to be more receptive to how the mother is feeling and sensing and experiencing her pregnancy. But for sure, in the third trimester, the baby is reacting to the mental states, emotional states of the mom.
So the baby is actually feeling the mother's emotions in the third trimester.
Yes, this is what research is showing and suggesting. And when we see how the brain is developing the limbic areas, it would make sense that the baby is a feeling. Again, these are not feelings that the baby would be able to recognize as joy or sadness or fear. They are sensory experiences that can overwhelm the baby's kind of nervous system, the senses.
Well, that makes sense because they wouldn't have a name for it because they've never been taught what happy means, but they would still feel happy. They could still feel terrified. They could still feel anxious. They just wouldn't have a name for it. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be how I would understand that. Um,
Wow.
Erin, I wanted to ask about how were you feeling during your pregnancy? I know you have a daughter, so do you want to share anything about that?
Yes. So my daughter is the best gift I've ever received from God. She's my world. And once I had her, everything changed for me. She's a true blessing. But when I was pregnant, I was terrified for my daughter because in my third trimester, every single week, I was told by my child's father that I was going to be left. I was so terrified that in the first time in my entire life, I had a panic attack. In the middle of the night, my whole body started to shake and wouldn't stop. My mom came over in the middle of the night to give me support. I believe there was a somatic release because the amount of anxiety and fear I was feeling during my pregnancy. I was also at my OB and he was hearing my baby's heartbeat, and he told me I needed to go to the emergency hospital. And I believe this is because of the amount of stress I was under. This was causing my baby's heartbeat to go faster. Would this be correct?
Yeah, so with the panic attack, your body would be flooding with cortisol and adrenaline because it's a state of fight or flight. And your baby would be feeling the effects of the cortisol and adrenaline too, because it crosses the placenta to the baby. And you're quite correct there that if your heart rate, your own heart rate is going really fast, the baby, that it would mimic the baby's heart rate.
We're
So the baby,
actually, it was OB who checked my child's heartbeat, and he said it was going really fast.
yeah, yeah. So sometimes during the third trimester as well, if baby has a really high heart rate, sometimes it's part of the normal development. Baby begins to grow a lot, they are moving more, and that can accelerate the heart rate. So just like if someone's listening and thinking the baby's heart rate has been going faster, sometimes it's part of the normal development. But sometimes, like perhaps Erin, in your case, this was the baby's response to what you were feeling. If you were
Okay.
very, very stressed and having a panic attack, so the baby would feel that too.
Whereas two separate times, but I know I was crying almost every day. I was terrified. I was terrified for my baby's sake. I was terrified for my baby's future and how my baby would be, what her life would be like. And I was so terrified. And I know so many women do not get this proper support that they need, and they can feel like they have no hope. But my baby, she's a healthy, happy, well-adjusted, confident child. My child's father is now getting help, and I didn't need to feel afraid. I didn't need to feel terrified. Everything turned out the way it needed to. And but I just remember even now as I'm speaking about it, my whole body's shaking.
Mm.
So, and that's a somatic release. Like it's still it's overwhelming to even talk about it. So I remember going through it. It was just it was so scary. Um, so I totally understand when women are going through that and when they don't have the proper support, it can be terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but we made it through, and she's doing really well, and I'm she's a huge blessing. She's changed everything for me.
I'm so glad you had a happy ending. So sometimes this can be really terrifying, like you said, when we have these really stressful experiences, and like the mother's whole life, they might not have a lot of support, and many women have that. They don't have support. There might be many socioeconomic factors, poverty. Some people are in the middle of war zones, and they are frightened for their lives and for their babies. And I am just very happy, Erin, to hear your story and how you pull through, and for your baby as well to be confident, happy, well adjusted, also speaks to the fact that the postnatal life is so important, and a lot of repair can happen postnatally. Your daughter is securely attached, what I've heard from you. And I think people also need to be aware of that if something goes wrong prenatally, it doesn't define everything. It doesn't say this is definitely going to be a bad outcome from here. It might create sensitivities later on for maybe babies not be so well adjusted. But again, if the postnatal environment, the caregiving after birth is good enough and is warm and tuned to the baby, then that can make all the difference.
Do these pre-birth experiences affect the baby into the adulthood?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research on, especially on epigenetics right now. And that means like how genes get expressed later on in life. And genes like that influence stress response, immune system, and susceptibility for certain mental health conditions. So the life in utero can like give notes to the genes to turn them off or on later on in life, depending on what the prenatal life was like. And also, what I talked about earlier, the prefrontal cortex. So if the prenatal environment is very toxic in a way, either with toxic stress or other kind of toxins going into the utero, then it can absolutely impact the way the brain starts to develop the prefrontal areas. And the prefrontal cortex is the one where we can plan, make judgments, regulate our emotions, overall have good sort of social skills, and inhibit behaviors as well. So if that part is not developing properly, it could be because there was some kind of trauma in utero for the baby. So that would definitely show up in adulthood.
And how do we best support the mother while she is pregnant?
So I see this as a public health concern. And I think a lot more resources and funding needs to go to support pregnancies, because the emotional well-being is as important than focusing in nutrition or getting pregnant women to exercise. So the emotional well-being is as important, if not more important than that, because emotional environment is a key environment for the baby when they're developing in the womb. So psychological stress can do a lot, as much as harm as toxins and alcohol and smoking during pregnancy. So we need to be more aware of that. And also, I would think that what we can really do to help moms and babies are two key things. So reduce stress during pregnancy. I know stress and reducing stress has become kind of a buzzword, but it is so important now that we know what the cortisol can do to the baby's neurobiology. And second is to increase the psychological and emotional bonding between mom and baby. So that's the maternal fetal attachment. So mom's own perspective and mom's own emotions around the pregnancy. So if we can help a bit more on those two key areas, then we might have children who have sort of more beneficial early start in life.
How about labor and delivery? I know personally speaking, when I was in labor, I was still feeling terrified. And I was crying a lot. My dad was present with me. He had tears in his eyes. It was traumatic. But I know other women, so many things can go wrong during a labor. How can this impact the child?
Yeah, so there is a whole field of prenatal and perinatal psychology that looks into birth imprints. So how the birth experience actually gets imprinted into the soma of the baby in their implicit and in their body memory. And I absolutely agree with you that the labor and delivery can be an incredibly powerful experience. For some women, it's an incredible experience. For others, it's traumatic. For me as well, it was very traumatic. And I think from what made my experience really difficult was that I felt like I didn't have a good communication with them, the clinicians involved, and my labor was very much prolonged. And then I ended up having an infection in the hospital. And then all that is to say that when my daughter was born, we had to be separated immediately because she needed to be taken into the NICU, into the high risk unit, because she needed medical attention. And like, even though I had tried to create my pregnancy as calm as possible I could, then I was completely taken aback by how the labor and delivery went. And I could have not predicted that it went that way. So there was a lot of repair that had to happen later on. And I as a mom, I had to really take into account the early beginning for my own daughter to be be extra attentive and extra attuned, and to be able to make sure that we could build secure relationship despite the fact that we had to be separated at birth for almost 3 weeks.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, so it's a long time, and going to the hospital every day to be with her, it's still not the same as being at home with your newborn baby on your chest, having skin to skin time, and I had none of that.
That
So
must have been
that's,
really hard on both of you.
yeah, it's something that I'm still writing about and dealing with. And I'm always really mindful that how that might impact my daughter. And I'm always kind of trying to be attentive, like if there's anything lingering there, but that's just a worried mom. But also the developmental psychologist in me that knows what can happen and is mindful of that.
And how old's your daughter now?
So she's going to be 3 soon.
So mine's 2 and yours is 3.
Yeah, so one will be 3 in a month. So still 2,
Okay.
but we're getting
What's the
there.
month? When's her birthday?
January.
January, mine's March. So they're very
Okay.
close then.
Yeah, winter and spring babies.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Erin.
all
Of
your direction and your advice and joining us today.
course, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.